Okay, thank you. Item 3 is the standard prohibition of whip votes and declarations of party whips. Item 4 is the minutes of the previous meeting, page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. Okay, all happy? Right, item 5 is public questions, and we have no public questions this morning. So that takes us on to item 6, which is the budget proposals for 2023-24 through to 26-27. Obviously, the leaders here, thank you for attending, and the Director of Finance, Mr. Ben Smith. So would you like to kick off, leader?
Yeah, I'll leave Ben to go through the detail of the report, and I know we've had an opportunity to discuss and ask questions at Cabinet already. I'll just really repeat some of the key points that we've made previously, in that really grateful for the additionality that's been provided by Welsh Government, because we were looking at a settlement probably around £13 million extra, and of course that has increased to around £29 million extra when you take off the Mumbles flood defence work, which we're being repaid for. So that is a significant improvement about where we thought we would be on the projections. However, it's significantly less than what we would be getting, just a standstill if you account for inflationary pressures, pay pressures, and of course the energy pressures. You'll know that the energy pressures for this authority have gone up, we think, from 5 million to close to 20 million this year. And because of the way in which the government pre-buys its energy, we're now locked in to that higher rate for at least the next 12 months. Whilst we're pleased to see energy prices starting to fall back, we won't benefit from that until at least the following year, assuming that price rises don't go up again. So overall, really helpful to have that extra money from Welsh Government, but it does not mean that we are out of the woods. And as Mr. Smith will sure tell you when he goes through the details, it still remains a very, very challenging budget situation due to energy, inflation, and pay pressures. And just finally, on the pay pressures side, you'll know that we've been very clear that we think that staff, not just in the council, but in public service, should receive a fair pay award, and one which helps cover the costs of the cost of living crisis, the energy and inflationary pressures they're facing. But like all employers, the government and the Treasury in London are the only ones with the financial firepower to make sure that those pay awards are covered. And what we've had to date is pay awards being agreed, but not the necessary funding flowing to the organisations to ensure that those pay awards can be fully funded with new money, and therefore organisations are being asked to look at funding pay awards through existing budgets. Now, you all know what that means. That means you have to cut the pie or the cake differently, and that means dividing existing resources between at a larger slice for each person, but therefore less slices to go around. So that's the challenge we've got, not just the general pressures, but pay pressures and some really challenging decisions being made by Treasury and those in power in London. I've lobbied, as you would expect me to, through the WLGA to the Welsh Government, through the WLGA and LGA to the UK Government. I'll continue to do that. But improved position, but doesn't fix all of our problems, and still some real challenges there. So at that point, Chair, I'll hand over to Mr. Smith, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Leader. Yes, I shall go through the report and highlight a number of obvious statements and technical matters. So in terms of the recommendations themselves, recommendation 1, I remind it, was a basis for starting consultation, and recommendation 2 about adopting it as a planning premise for the future. I can only do so much crystal ball gazing and tea leaf reading, and I'm afraid I'm into my metaphors already. Recommendation 3, it was the start of consultation. The Leader, I and many others have started a lot of formal consultation with a number of statutory consultees and bodies, and that remains ongoing. And all of this remains contingent upon listening to all the feedback from the scrutiny panels, from Scrutiny itself, and from the public consultation, staff consultation, trade unions, and that's in recommendation 4. Section 1.7, yes, we are in a repeat of yet another very, very late settlement that came on the 14th of December with final not due until March. And that has meant my officers ran around a bit Keystone Cops, but it was important to get the budget proposals out as quickly as possible. And as the leader has acknowledged, the very significant cash funding increase for 23-24 is very, very welcome. But it is still the case that it must fund an awful lot of pressures, including any pay awards, and we are not in control of those pay awards as an individual employer. Section 3.6, yeah, headline £31.2 million increase, but as the leader has acknowledged, the Mumble CRMP scheme pays partly for itself, so it's down to about £29 million once you strip that one out. My planning assumptions that are referenced in 3.7 are hugely material around energy costs and future year settlements, some of the biggest elements in the budget. Section 4.3 emphasises that it's a repeat of last year, in nominal terms phenomenal, in real terms utterly surreal, because we are struggling to keep pace with any pretense of inflation and some of the pressures in the system. But I do make the point in 4.3 in bold that there are still over £75 million worth of cash sums going in over the next 4 years into directorate budgets, with more going into central pots as well. But nonetheless, the real term spending power of that is severely a number of planning assumptions I've made, and picking up on a theme from the leader, if you look at the catch up for the unfunded 22-23 pay awards in note 2, plus my assumptions, and they are only assumptions over potential settlement of pay awards for local government staff and teachers, and it's clearly far from resolved given some of the union ballot results overnight in relation of teachers. You add those first 4 lines up, it comes to more than the entire increase in the settlement. That's before you even read any of the other items. I draw your attention to the teachers' pension item line 5, it's the third one down. There is a potential major uplift in teachers' pension costs in 24-25. That's in as a place marker at the moment. We don't know what it will be. Rest assured, I have openly consulted and drawn attention to it to head teachers and the school budget forum. As has been referenced, energy price inflation at note 6. There is at the moment still provision for £15 million, but we decoupled it from the base budget, and line 6 also then aims to divert money from the Economic Recovery Fund to pay for it in the short term. And you'll note that by year 4, the draw from reserves to fund that energy bill is 0, which means it technically is then in the base by year 4. I am buying this council as much time as possible on the basis of energy projections. They may of course come down, they may of course go up, but at the moment the strategy is to provide sufficient time to be able to afford them in the base once they hopefully settle down. And if prices do come down, hey, that can only be a bonus. But because they're all funded short term from reserves, they are not in the base budget at the moment until that final year of the MTFP. Note 7 indicates aspirations around future capital charges, which is referenced elsewhere in the report because of an aspiration to undertake up to £50 million worth of new unsupported borrowing, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. And then the next line, the Coastal Risk Management Programme that the leader has already referred to. I will draw attention to line 11 because the Fire Authority continues to decide its overall levy, and I will tread carefully. They are independent of us and they set their own levy, but that is a material levy increase far in excess of anything previously experienced and far in excess of anything provided for in the standard spending assessment. As a levying body, they tell us what they want, and it's for me to make arrangements to do it. But that is a very material cost, which has been highlighted, identified on a couple of previous occasions. Those are the main items in that table, and I'll take questions on the table and the assumptions because it is important you understand the assumptions on those, and feel free to ask me questions once I've finished presenting. I'm going to skip quite a bit forward to section 4.15, picking up on that assumption around the aspiration, but it's not built into the capital programme yet, of further borrowing, partly as a result of being able to underpin applications to the Levelling Up Fund, Shared Prosperity Fund, but also the inflation pressures that abound in our capital programme. But emphasising that the Mumble CRMP, when it came to Cabinet, I entered into discussions with the Welsh Government, and I can confirm it is fully funded in the settlement. Welsh Government was as good as it would in terms of providing for that in the revenue support grant. So it is important that you bear that in mind. I draw your attention next to table 5, just at the end of section 5.5, as has been alluded to by the leader and others. You add up those savings, there's still £22.3 million of cash savings required from services and a further near £3 million from schools, making £25 million in cash savings required at the moment on the planning assumptions made. That is, can only be described as very material and very significant, and will have significant impacts on the authority's spend power ultimately. Section 5.6, in terms of the energy fund, has indicated our assumption around up to £15 million worth of costs. I've advised you that we didn't benefit from the existing UK government scheme, and having been in contact with Crown Commercial Services, it indicates that we will not benefit from next year's scheme either. However, commercial rates have come down a little bit, and I will be updating my officer advice back to Cabinet. There may be some reduction in our spend there that might enable us to consider some more support for strategic partners, or it would be a reduction in draw from reserves, because as I said, none of that is in the base budget till year 4 at the moment. That is a material amount. Whenever anyone looks at spending assessments and how much has gone into potentially education, social care, or anything else, notwithstanding I've said I could spend it all on pay, I could spend half of it again on energy price rises alone. Really, really challenging numbers, but I'm pleased with the technical solution we've got for de-risking it in a very short term and decoupling it from other budget savings. Picking up on the theme of those budget savings excluding schools, if I take you to section 5.9 and table 7, the budget proposals for our services excluding schools, it's that £22 million net figure. You can see what the assumptions are. Effectively £7 million worth of financial engineering and trickery on reductions, safe on both national insurance contributions and pension contributions. The next biggest item, service income rises in line with inflation and catching up on inflation, given headline inflation is over 10% this year. It will come down next year, but it could be a little bit sticky. And there is an opportunity to consider charging users for services. It is, after all, what the private sector do. It is what others do in terms of charging for services where there are significant cost increases. We have an other line for anything we can't find anywhere other line to put it, but you will note that the workforce savings are the smallest of all of the savings proposals, but it's clear that just under £4 million is still a material cash saving on the workforce, and I'm sure there will be questions and concerns on that as you ask further questions on the report in due course. If I go to section 5.14 and table 8, it summarises the main pressures on schools' delegated budgets, which, excluding energy because we're centrally funding, is about 13 million. And at the moment over the page, it indicates that we've got about 10 million pounds that we can put into schools. We've been open and transparent with head teachers and the school budget forum. That still requires a net saving in cash from schools. That increase is, when you look at the headline of £117 million worth of additional funding for education in Wales, we're about 7.5% of the pot. So anything over £9 million means we've clearly passported on whatever we've had from Welsh Government, and we've made that clear in both the consultation meetings we've had so far with school leaders and their representatives. And move on then to table 9 in section 5.16, which pulls it all back together again. And this is the one that reminds that without that very welcome significant front loading yet again of another huge increase in nominal cash funding, and without some of those other items we were looking at council pressures of £60 million in a single year, and that table summarises how we've prioritised stuff and dealt with it. Half of it's come from grant support from Welsh Government, a very relatively small amount from council tax income, but still, you know, there are burdens on households, and I'm sure there will be concern over the levels of council tax income and council tax rises proposed. A relatively small proportion coming from schools, given there was clear prioritisation in ministerial comments and covering letters in the settlement, and therefore a still very significant £22 million ask from other services. I cannot emphasise how big that ask is, and that, you know, in cash terms. Section 6, I'm not going to read them all out, but I emphasise every single one of those risks and uncertainties abounds. I've continued to say it's been uncertain for the last few years with COVID. Pressures on pay awards, on inflation, overspending risks, all of those remain live and valid, and it remains another fuzzy year in terms of the outlook. I'm going to skip past section 7. It's all in the normal format, and most of section 8. I'll draw your attention to table 10, which is just over the page from section 8.1, 8.4. it emphasises that there were, at the point of drawing up the draft proposals, up to 68 posts, FTEs, at risk. But I emphasise the bit in bold and underlined, they are not automatically at risk of compulsory redundancy, and ongoing mitigations continue to be taken with every possibility of reducing that to a smaller number as possible in line with stated political aspirations. That continues to be an ongoing approach, and as is normal at this time of year, we are unable to advise on individual schools figures. The generosity of the settlement and the generosity of the amount put into schools means I would expect that to be relatively low, but given I've indicated there is a major savings asking cash still required of schools as a whole, that may, you know, be ultimately a figure that will grow. It'll be decisions taken by individual school bodies. And given the pay award for the current year has not been settled with the teaching unions, let alone negotiations started on next year's, that is still up for debate. I think in terms of my final comment, I just draw your attention to the table in section 9.4 and table 11. It's the normal budget timetable, which takes us all the way through to ultimately Cabinet reconvening in February, recommending to Council in March. We remain a little bit uncertain as Treasurers as to what will happen, because at the moment the final budget for the Welsh Government is late going through the Senedd, which means the final settlement will be late, and it has been flagged there is at least one change to final settlement coming. There will be some additional revenue support grant for the fire authority as a result of a technical transfer. It's unhelpful it's coming super late, but it is what it is. We will continue to make some assumptions and take some assumptions based on what advice and intelligence we get from Welsh Government. So normal format. Being much better than anything I was foretelling through October, November, December through to Council. The quasi-euphoria must not dampen the fact that it is still 22 million from services, 25 million if you include schools, and by no stretch of the imagination is any part of that easy for next year. And of course, as set out in the report, the outcome longer term remains much grimmer. Both in real terms and nominal terms. So I think I'll pause there in terms of a canter through, and I'm happy to hand back to you, Chair. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Now then, are there anyone got any questions or comments? I'm sure there must be a few. Councillor Jeff Jones.
Sorry, I couldn't get the hand up. Yeah, with regards to November, December, you actually painted quite a dire picture. And actually going back then, we were talking about reserves. If I can remember rightly, I asked you, what sort of usable reserves have we got? And you said, I think it was 160 million. And in that November, December time, you projected that we would use probably a quarter of our reserves, i.e. 40 million. With regards to the current picture, what sort of figure are we talking about with regards to using reserves in the present format?
So if I perhaps take a step back, I recognise all of what you've said there, Councillor Jones, and you're right. I've given advice in previous scrutiny panels around first and second quarter and monitoring in the current year. We have just under 170 million pounds in usable reserves. It's 168 million. I've indicated and given advice to Cabinet that in the current year, because of the unfunded pay awards and pressures, that I would expect up to 30 million pounds drawn from our own reserves and 10 million from schools, being a 40 million pound draw from reserves. That would take reserves down from 170 to 130 million. And for the avoidance of doubt, the outline planning proposals, taking into account that there will be a further draw from schools reserves, almost certainly given the funding contribution they require to make, The £15 million energy fund is itself a draw from the Economic Recovery Fund. Cabinet made a decision on future highways capital spending that was drawn from a mix of ERF, Capital Equalisation Reserve, and the Insurance Reserve. Is that I still expect up to £30 million to be drawn from reserves for the coming year, which was the advice I gave to Cabinet on the 22nd of December. And I made clear again in terms of my advice to Cabinet, as a Treasurer, I would not normally be happily recommending 40 million in one year followed by 30 in another year, but we are in very, very strange times with unprecedented pressures. The corollary, of course, is we used to have £70 million in reserves. Over the space of the last 3 years, this council has added £100 million to reserves. And what are jam jars for other than when they need to be used? So the order of magnitude has remained relatively unchanged, partly because of the way we've repurposed stuff. As the leader has acknowledged in Cabinet, we would have, as officers and members, preferred to have spent £15 million worth of the Economic Recovery Fund on things in Swansea, not on paying £15 million potentially of energy bills, but it's still a draw from reserves. And clearly we would have had much higher savings proposals. When you look at that table that indicates we were in the realms of needing to cover off 60 million, I mean, Treasurers are always glass half empty. I do acknowledge the material increase in funding, but you know, you've still got major asks, both in terms of savings asks to address the real pressures that are in the system. But for the avoidance of doubt, there remain major planned draws in both years. I remain relaxed in terms of my technical advice because the amount being drawn potentially over the next couple of years is less than the amount we added in the previous 3 years. Long answer, but hopefully helps address the point you were making, Councillor Jones.
You're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry, yes, I just said thanks very much.
Okay. Rob, do you want to come in here on this issue?
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. I mean, Mr. Smith has made the point I was going to make around the ERF, but I think it's important one needs repeating because the ERF, as members will know, was set up so that members could bid for investment in their communities and their wards based on the priorities of their residents. That's the whole idea. We were the only area of Wales, the only council in Wales to set up this type of fund, but that fund has to have been reallocated to meet the energy costs because, as Mr. Smith said when he was covering his report, of course, we didn't benefit from the previous government help, and we're not going to benefit from the future help. We've been locked out. In fact, you know, the document that was announced at the time of the budget specifically made it clear that councils and public sector were excluded from the help that was available to others. So we've had to move money that was earmarked for improvements in Swansea to help schools and care homes and other consumers of energy, you know, deal with the very high energy bills. I think the other point I would make decisions. You look around Wales where people do not have that sort of, and you'll have seen in Powys they made an initial decision around mothballing some of their swimming pools. We're not doing that. They've rolled back on that, as my understanding. There are other councils looking at moving to monthly bin collections or closing community centres or closing schools. We're not proposing to do any of that. So again, you know, it is this important point that must never be lost, is that we are in a funding situation where the Treasury in London really hold all the cards. And if they do not release the necessary funding to councils in England, to councils in Scotland and Wales, and through the Welsh government and Scottish governments, then we do not receive the necessary funding in order to make the sort of decisions we'd want to make. And there's a really good example of it there with the energy. We're locked out of the help. We're therefore having to repurpose our own reserves, and that is going to mean communities across Swansea who all of you, I'm sure, will have been wanting to put forward schemes for, not being able to put forward schemes for that fund this year because it will no longer exist because the money's been used for energy. So I just wanted to expand on that point because it's really important our communities understand why that money is no longer there.
Okay, thank you, Leader. Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thanks. I've just got a technical question on the Appendix B on page 38. You're proposing to save £1.5 million by rebasing the council tax reduction scheme. I just wonder if you could explain how that happens.
I'm
Yeah,
happy
so
to
we've
answer,
had
but
discussion.
Mr. Smith will give you the technical
Yeah,
answer.
I was addressing you to Mr. Smith, Rob, yes.
It's an interesting one, Councillor Black, because we've had discussions on this in the past on a number of matters. I mean, CTRS, Council Tax Reduction Scheme, is a locally administered relief, and it is expensed in quite an odd way. There's a finite sum in the revenue support grant, and every time you put council tax up, effectively 22p in the pound is financed locally by other taxpayers. Like many benefits, and this is, I think, the particular bit that you'll probably come up with some follow-up on in terms of concerns, like many benefits, unless they're automatically given, people don't always choose to claim them. So our starting position is whenever a decision is made on council tax reduction scheme, we had extraordinary council last week where you agreed the new same CTRS scheme, but I have made budget provision for a potential return to the long run council tax planning assumptions, which is around 5% as a central assumption. I emphasize no decision has been made in the current year or future years, but we automatically put an amount in for uplifts. But despite whatever we put in, we never seem to get as many people claiming it as we thought would claim it. And that's a separate matter for debate and discussion. But you'll be aware that in the first, and when we come on to the second quarter, we have a £2 million shortfall on collecting council tax. And I currently have coming on to nearly a couple of £1 million of underspending despite my officers' best endeavours, and I would love them to be doing more on take-up, but they've also been focusing on giving out all the other emergency cash grant handouts and payments for those under pressure, that despite best endeavours, people simply do not claim it. So on the basis that I've been all year keeping a significant underspend on CTRS, which has helped pay for the tax base shortfall, you as a council agreed in November to the revised lower tax base, which removes that risk of not collecting the council tax we've assumed. It seems prudent to me to rebase it down. I emphasise I fill in every year the integrated impact assessment, and the reality is if more people present, if more people choose to take up, it is not capped. So there is a greater risk of there being overspending if more people present in perilous circumstances. And clearly, given the current outlook for the economy for 2023, there is a real risk of that. My judgment is that it is a safe and proportionate one to do because it doesn't immediately cause any impact on council services or on staff. And I will manage it in due course because I manage both the bit below the line as your treasurer, and I also manage the bit above the line as your manager of revenues and benefits. But it's one that's safe to take because the metrics say it is safe to take, but there is a wider policy dimension around, do all the right people take up all the benefits they're entitled to? And sadly, we know they don't. And I am therefore able to take that saving quite safely. But I'm sure you may want to come back with a follow-up, Councillor Black, because there are those wider matters, maybe not just on the technicals, but I've presumed. But that's what it's about. Technically, it's quite safe to take the bottom line and the top line, and the two sort of cancel each other out. But there are wider policy matters that may be debated elsewhere for another day.
No, I understand that. Essentially, you're basing you're budgeting on the base of historic take-up, as opposed to what you budgeted for in the past. Yeah, I mean, I understand that, and it's very sad, but that's where we are, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? I can't see anybody else with their hand up. Can I then, if that's the case, can I ask a number of questions? Just to reiterate a few things. The first one is that our energy bill has been estimated to go up to 20 million. Have we got a definite figure for that now?
Perhaps if I come in again, do you want to go leader first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you want to add something, Ben. My understanding, Chair, is that we've pre-bought around 80 to 85% of the energy at the present time. So therefore, we've got a high degree of certainty of what the costs will be. But you'll have seen in recent weeks the energy price falling. So there is likely to be some tail-ending reduction in terms of that last 15% or so. So that's why, as Mr. Smith referenced, we think it's still in the order of 20 million, may come down a bit from that when we know the final pricing. But certainly because of the need to pre-buy energy, we're locked in at that higher rate for the next year. So yeah, it's probably going to be somewhere between, we think, 13.5 and 15 million extra on top of the 5 million we're currently paying.
Right, okay,
and I would just add that includes potential anticipated asks from very key suppliers room, and as the leader has indicated, there may be a little bit more wiggle room in the very short term, between 80 and 85% of our energy already. So we know with near certainty the 23-24 figure, bar that tail end bit. And as the leader has indicated, if these energy prices remain low, whilst we will not go back to pre-Ukraine invasion levels, we could potentially benefit in 24, 25. It's the beauty of being able to take it all out of the equation and stick it on the side and say, I'll fund it all from reserves. It means it hasn't driven otherwise silly decisions in the short term, but it also means we've got, if there is headroom, we can unwind elements of it, but crucially, none of it is in the base. So equally, it's not an immediate windfall dividend to spend on new base spending, but it is the beauty of having taken it to the side because we did have large reserves and say, we will deal with it in due course. At the moment, I am saying I can finance in the base by year 4. If those energy prices stick at their much lower level, it will be a lower figure overall, and I may be able to put it in the base faster. And when it goes in the base, that gives certainty to spending departments in place. It potentially gives certainty to partners, and crucially, it gives spending certainty to schools. I've had a number of discussions with school leaders, both through the head teachers with the leader and then school budget forum. And the messaging from the representatives there is they understand entirely why we've done it this way. And they'd take rather than a guaranteed sum of maybe £1 million in the school delegated budget, they'd take a promise of 6 and will be in the base in due course very, very gratefully. The corollary is it means it doesn't show immediately in the school funding stats, and they've understood that. And I expect the school budget forum to acknowledge that. But it is the beauty and simplicity of being able to just put £15 million worth of poker chips on one side and say, see if that'll do it. And I think it will. And it probably means we'll bring the cost down and we will faster put it in the base. But at the moment, it's pretty much locked on with certainty for 23-24, Chair, as the leader has already indicated.
Because the gas price, as opposed to electricity price, the gas price is obviously regulated on a 6-monthly basis or 3-monthly basis. And the fact is that yesterday, there was a comment passed by quite a number of commentators that the gas price has come down, but it will take at least 3 months for that to come back into the system, and then the cap is reintroduced. So there may be, as you say, wriggle room towards the end. The pay award's not fully funded. That's right across the board. Is that correct, Leader?
Well, again, shall I go first on the technicals?
Yep.
Clearly the case. I mean, we set the budget with a pay award of a couple of percentage points in the current year, and that's driving the overspends in the current year. There is clearly no funding for 5% for teachers in the current year, nor was there sufficient funding for the equivalent of 7% in the current year for associate staff. The Welsh Government has been very honest in its assessment and in its covering letter. I mean, the only thing I've got to go on for next year is I think the local government pay award at national level is likely to be very similar. Teachers is subject to pay review body and Welsh Minister's decision. They haven't given us a guide to an amount, but I've budgeted for 3.5. You just do the maths on the figure. Lines of the catch-up pay award and next year's assumptions, which may be on the low side given the differential in pay awards between public and private sector, again reported on today.
Yes.
And given that teachers' pay is not an agreed figure even in the current year, let alone next year, my technical advice is it clearly doesn't fund it. The Welsh Government acknowledges that the risk is on us, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn there. I think it's very clear. The Welsh Government have made very clear there is no more money, and therefore on that basis there can't be enough in the system in the first place. It's a political matter to debate what's fair, what's everything else. I've got to pick it up at a technical level and make an assumption over an amount of money, and on the basis of the metrics, it can't be funded. Is my assessment as your officer.
Given that that's the case, so the teachers' pay award for last year is still in the system and still hasn't been settled, so that any increase the following year will actually be added to that as well.
That would be the risk. It would be a compounding effect. So at the moment, teachers have been paid that 5% because Welsh ministers have made a decision that that is the figure, but clearly it is not resolved in a trade union industrial relations matter. And if it were to be higher, that's for others to decide, then there would be a further compounding effect, as there would be if, because the school teachers pay review body gave a 2-year indicative figure to Welsh ministers, yes, they will be revisiting it. I think it's been well made across all pay review bodies, at a UK level, let alone the devolved matters, that those pay recommendations were made at a time when inflation was meant to be 2, 3, 4% and ticking up a bit, and they now look very long dated and in the tooth. And I would expect there is more risk to them being raised up than raised down, and that will double compound the pressure. So I think there is a real risk of pressures in year for 23-24. But I'll cut to the chase. As I said to School Budget Forum, the reality is if I made different assumptions and put a higher figure in for the pay award, the money is finite. We've been told there's £117 million more for education. If I keep just doubling a number, I've just got to double my assumption on a saving elsewhere. But you're absolutely right. There is a risk of a double compounding effect again, Chair.
Right.
On teachers, I'm much more confident on associate staff, given that the pay award was set for the current year.
I can understand that. That's understandable because of how that is controlled, whereas these teachers are independent. Right, okay. Next question, I think, is any more capital spend? Because if we are, there's a comment in here about 50 million. Now, given the fact that the interest rates are considerably higher now, and I suspect that I did see somewhere the figure 50 million. That would cost us around about £3 million per year in revenue cost. And given the way that our revenue is currently, and given the projections that we've had for the future, that would become very, very unaffordable, or very, very difficult to actually find a headroom in the revenue count for that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So perhaps if I go first, should I go first and then defer to you politically, Leader, or do you want to go first on this one?
I'll go first on this one, Ben,
Okay.
if I can, please. Yeah, so, Chair, I think you can't make that direct assumption at this point in time because whilst there is a reference to 50 million in there, it's related to a number of points, including the fact that if we're successful in the levelling up bids that we put in, obviously there is a required contribution from this authority in order to draw down that money from UK government. We don't get money from UK government for free. We have to put up some of our money in order to draw it down. So that is part of the process that every council will have to go through if it wants to access levelling up funding. I think that the point also needs to be put here. This is not just about taking out additional borrowing with no net reduction in existing borrowing, because of course what's happened over the last few years, as Mr. Smith has said a number of times at council and cabinet meetings, is we've been successful in reducing the pool rate of our borrowing and reducing the overall costs of our borrowing from historic rates when interest rates were much, much higher. That obviously has been something of benefit to this council. We repay, I think Mr. Smith will correct me if I'm wrong, but around £14 million every year we repay in terms of existing borrowing. So we do that. So even standing still means that we reduce our borrowing every year. So this is about highlighting the fact that we may need to take out some additional borrowing. I will rely on Mr. Smith and his officers to make a judgment in terms of the most advantageous time to take that borrowing out if it's needed, as they've done previously. And I think Mr. Smith has been proved right in terms of his timing previously, where we borrowed, as you know, at around 1.96%. Now, I think, Chair, you were right to refer to the fact that there was a massive spike in the cost of borrowing, and that followed on from obviously the debacle of the Trust Administration and the decisions made there, which cost pension funds over £60 billion, drove up interest rates for homeowners, and then left councils with higher longer term borrowing rates. Those are the direct results of the Trust Administration decisions. We have seen the borrowing rates for councils coming down, for public sector borrowing coming down, but they're not back to the levels they were when we took out borrowing previously. So you are right to a point. I think just to make a statement now that it's unaffordable, I think we need to wait to see all of the facts, what sort of funding we get from UK government, what the actual need is before we make that sort of determination. But of course, we have to match some of the funding available to us through levelling up if we're successful.
Funding, it is on it's on that table 1. It says where are we? capital charges, new schemes, aspirations, there's £1 million in there. So I'm not saying that we aren't paying back money. Of course we're paying back money because we pay interest plus capital plus the principal. But we're already paying an extra £1 million this year. So I accept what you're saying, and but you know, we need to be mindful of what possibly, if we have had a successful levelling up build or any other where grant that we have to put money to, we have to be very mindful of what that is going to cost us in our revenue account.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, look, I don't disagree with the point around making sure that it's whatever we do is affordable. And of course, we've got the Future Schools programme to come, where we will again need to make sure that we match the contribution given to us by Welsh Government for future schools that we wish to build. So we can't avoid the fact that there is inevitably going to be need for our to make a contribution to the major schemes that we have to do. And some of that will come through asset sales, as it's been in the past, and some of it will come, no doubt, through borrowing. That is the way that we've always had to meet the challenges before us. I think Mr. Smith can answer on the technicals in terms of the costs, but what I would point out, I'm sure Mr. Smith will add to it, is when we make assumptions on some of the future costs of borrowing, we do so at pool rates, and that might not be reflective of the actual rates of borrowing that we take out. I think it's an important point not to lose sight of. But I'll hand over to Mr. Smith now to do the technicals.
Thank you, Leader. Mr. Smith, Ben?
Yes, so it's no surprise I agree with what you both said to varying degrees, because that's the reality of it. The 50 million is referenced in the report. I deal with reminding members of what is to come, and that is an aspiration at the moment, and it comes with the caveats the leader has rightly said around we don't know what will be the case. So that table that you've referred to, Chair, yes, that £1 million for future capital aspirations is in, growing to 2 million, growing to 3 million, and you've done your maths right, because 50 million at the prevailing likely marginal cost of borrowing with the repayment of principal would cost £3 million in the base by the end of the medium-term financial plan. So that's why you've got 0, 1, 2, 3 million. If you go down a couple of lines, you'll then see draw from capital equalisation reserve. 0, yes. -1, -2, -3. That's because it neutralises it for the life of the medium-term plan, but it's also because of what I've given advice to both Cabinet and yourselves previously, which is we are cash rich. I've borrowed 210 million at some of it as low as 1.89%. I'll show off even a little bit more, Leader. You'll have to indulge me with that one, because clearly that's way below any market rates. And the strategy has been we may need to spend that amount of capital. We're not quite sure when. And I certainly won't be externalising the borrowing anytime soon, because I'm still waiting for rates, whilst they've stabilised and come down quite a bit. They're still more than double what I borrowed at previously. So I am sitting and waiting, and will do it as late as I can. And therefore, I continue to draw down from the capital equalisation reserve in the very short run. Yes, the repayment, we use it as a kind of shorthand. Of course, at a technical level, technically we don't repay the borrowing in year, because obviously we borrow as repayment on maturity in 50 years time, but we do make minimum revenue provision as required under the law, and it is around the £14 million year mark. So the leader's shorthand of it being equivalent to repaying it is kind of right, but technically it's done a different way. But that's just the way of it. The important thing is we do make prudent provision for all minimum revenue provisions required. Some authorities of England got themselves into very grave difficulty by thought they could defy all of that arrangements. Clearly, the capital equalisation reserve is proving its worth in terms of buying plenty of time. And you will be aware that because, as the leader has indicated, we budget at the pool rate, and we have got it down from over 6 to under 4. We borrow at the marginal rate, and by borrowing at 2%, we always end up in the budget monitoring with an underspend on capital financing, because I haven't had to borrow it all. Secondly, capital tends to slip. And now we've got the new bonus, which is, of course, I borrowed 210 million at 2%, and those rates are fixed for forever till maturity. Base rates have gone up 9 times, and all the cash on the balances I'm getting in the meantime are making me several £1 million a year of investment income in the short term, bringing down further the net cost of borrowing. So we've borrowed at a fixed rate, we're earning at a variable rate, and they've all worked exactly in our favour at the moment, which is jolly pleasing. And it means you'll get further underspends on capital financing for the next couple of years, which means I'll be rocking up with budget monitoring reports and outturn reports, adding to the capital equalisation reserve, which means there's a bigger pot there to defer the time at which I do have to externalise that potential new borrowing. And I'll only do it, and I hope to get nearly as lucky again. I don't think I'll repeat 1.89% rates, but if I could get them at 2 point something, I'd probably do it then. It's that where those, we talk about the jam jars and the reserves, but the flexibility of all of them, they all have specific purposes. And they have given us enormous financial firepower and enormous flexibility on the choosing of the timing to do things. And so I go back to my metaphor with the £15 million of energy poker chips. So far, whenever we've bet on black or red and it's come up, we haven't had a green one yet because, I can't help but use my metaphors, but they've been very, very useful to us. And it's that flexibility across the piece which has enabled us to avoid some of the ravages that other authorities are clearly facing, mostly over the border.
The fact is that we borrowed that money. We borrowed it against projects, though. We didn't borrow it against investment as such. We borrowed it because, as you know, rightly say, you cannot borrow money without a project to use it for. So it's just that it's slipped and we've used that money and we've been benefiting from it, which is really good. Marvelous that investment has actually, we must be one of the few organizations that has actually borrowed money and making money on it through the interest rate increase. So that's that's really beneficial. A couple of other things then. The savings from last year, obviously we got the monitoring report on Q2 coming up, and we won't know what the actual outturn of that will be till around about, I would have thought May, June at the earliest. So it's difficult to say. I know what you said in the report, that it's difficult to predict that one is. Couple of minor things now. First of all, the insurance fund, I haven't seen it in the document. It isn't in table 1. I've looked back through it again, but I can't see it in there. So if we could have an idea of what that is. And I think it's also, we must remind ourselves that the usable reserves are money that's been built up either through revenue savings, through capital slippage, or actually grants that have been given to us that we put to one side. And I think it's very important that we realise that.
So again, if I come back, Chair, first of all, on the insurance fund, no reserves are referenced in the table itself for budget planning purposes, for MTFP purposes. The reserve draws to and fro are significantly addressed as part of budget setting with the February report and ultimately through to Council in March. You will in previous years seen items saying draws from, to, or from the insurance reserve because they've been an explicit part of the coming budget strategy.
Yes.
For the avoidance of doubt, the coming budget strategy assumes no further draw or add to insurance reserves. That is because I think it was December, it might have been November, Cabinet received an FPR7 report, which I'd signed off, which indicated an additional £5 million worth of highway spend with a mixture of draws from reserves, including £3 million over the next couple of years from insurance reserves. Yes. So that is hard baked in and was a decision made in the current year. It is not an explicit additional planning assumption for going forward. There's about £17 million in the insurance reserve at the end of 21-22's accounts. If you draw a further £3 million as a result of the Cabinet decision, albeit these are in staged payments over future years, that decision has already been made, so it takes it down to 14 million. And my estimate is that, we take actuarial advice on how likely it is to cover all liabilities. It remains prudent, but it's not as well funded as the pension fund now. But the pension fund has had a sterling set of returns, and that's why that's referenced as one of the savings elsewhere. Yeah, well, okay, that may be a debate for another man, but that's the reason why the insurance fund isn't further referenced planning assumption. It's code for, it's one of the jam jars I'm saying I'll put the lid back on for now. But obviously decisions are taken on an annual basis as to what's right and proper, and if a major event occurred, we may have a major draw from those reserves. I'm aware of other authorities in Wales that have, we seem to have avoided most of the excesses of floods again, but by goodness, they seem to be happening with increasing frequency. And if they flood our properties or damage our highways, there will be insurance claims and there will be draws on that fund going forward. So it's a hint the jam jar lid is pretty firmly closed on that one for now, but I remain open to views and comments from all parties when they come up with budget proposals.
Can I ask a question on that then? the actuarial examination of that fund, how is that done? Because if it's over the years we've taken from it, we've put it back in, we've taken from it and back in, and I was under the impression actuarial examination should be done every 3 years, as with the pension fund. And you are right, the pension fund has been remarkably well managed to give us that huge amount of money that we've been allowed to not pay into the fund over the next 3 years. So how do we do the actuarial return on the insurance fund? Because if there's 17 or 14 million in there now, obviously that's a very tempting figure, a very tempting amount of money that could be used elsewhere. So how do we do the actuarial refund examination of that?
So again, I'll use both of them as examples. So the pension fund is inarguable. It has to be done every 3 years in law, and is done so, and is published openly and transparently with funding rates. That is unavoidable. The insurance reserve is at my choosing, because all earmarked reserves and general fund reserves, they're ultimately the council's disposal, but it's based on my best professional advice. So when I choose to get an actuarial valuation and a professional valuation from it, I do so. And for the avoidance of doubt, I'm just turning the jam jar lid really tight now. I did one before I signed off on the proposals to Cabinet of drawing a further £3 million from the insurance reserve. And I am satisfied that it is significantly adequately funded for most eventualities. But whereas we've said the pension fund is, for the first time in living memory, if not for never, 100% funded, we do not run with the insurance fund 100% funded. What happens is they look at past claims in and assumptions around similar sized organizations and come up with a funding window of what they think is reasonable. And it will come as no surprise, I am not an actuary. It's even someone who's even duller and can do maths even more complicated than I can. And when they tell me a funding range, I take it. I've drawn it. So in reality, that jam jar lid is currently closed. I can commission a review anytime, at any point in time. To persuasion and debate, because as you rightly say, Chair, jam jar away for compared to others. But for the avoidance of doubt, at the moment, I am satisfied it is exactly the figure I think it should be in terms of my professional advice. And that's why I've allowed what's been drawn, and I'm unlikely to reopen it in the next year. But hey, I can commission a review at any point in time. And if claims go down, at the moment, I don't see any likelihood of them going down. I could reconsider it. So I've just tightened the jar a little bit tighter on that one, Chair, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have no other questions. The other ones I got, I will write to you, but also put in the letter as well. Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yes, sorry to labour this. Going back to this, the capital charges and the borrowings, the 50 million. So to clarify, we may not end up borrowing 50 million. It's not something that I'm sure you haven't just come up with a figure of 50 million. You must have a breakdown of what's actually contained within that, shall we say, projection or aspiration. And you actually mentioned as well that I can actually see that the use of capital equalisation reserve is actually, shall we say, paying for this borrowing or for the charges on the borrowing. And you actually said in the short term, this borrowing is over 50 years. So is it anticipated, if we borrow 50 million, that the capital equalisation reserve will actually pay for that borrowing over the 50-year term?
So I'll start with that last bit. Clearly, no. It is only to cover it for the short term. It can only be for the short term. It's a finite reserve. But you are right, Councillor Jones. The reality is it may not be £50 million. I do have some working assumptions as to the sorts of things that are likely to be under pressure in terms of inflationary pressures on existing schemes that will work through the system. But as the leader has also said, our bids to levelling up. Let's be honest, if we win nothing under levelling up bids, I won't be needing to match fund that. I hope that's not the outcome. I don't know the timing of it, but the reality is I've said I might need to borrow up to £50 million net. There is also borrowing from the Mumble CRMP, but that's effectively becomes supported borrowing in the settlement. So I am laying down a clear marker saying I might need to borrow 50 million. I might not, and I don't yet know the timing, but my planning assumption for the avoidance of doubt in the MTFP is I'm going to borrow it over not next year, but over the following 3 years, and in the very short term finance it from the capital equalisation reserve, because I don't know when I'm going to do it. I've indicated I'm likely to do it right at the end because I want to give rates the best possible chance to come down. But that £3 million will ultimately need to be funded for in the base. And I go back to advice I gave when previously asked at Scrutiny. I am utterly agnostic about the decision over capital financing. The decision to prioritise revenue versus capital and whether there's sufficient revenue headroom, whether that be income increases, council tax increases, or revenue savings to pay for it, I'm still not at a level that the capital borrowing worries me at current level, nor if that £50 million were the figure and were it to be externalised. But that's a policy choice for members. But at the moment, it clearly will not cover it for life. It's a bit like the energy one, where I've said I don't want it to be a determining factor in setting the current coming year's budget or the next couple of years if I don't think I'm going to actually do any additional borrowing over the next couple of years. But I am laying a clear marker down because if and when it is borrowed, it will cost money, and it will cost money for 50 years, and it will need to be fully provided for in the revenue base. But it's buying that flexibility in time, because at the moment I am not planning to borrow it until I have to borrow it. And at the moment, that could be right at the end of the current medium-term financial planning cycle. You will recall previously I've indicated I hoped that the capital equalisation reserve should certainly get us through to 27-28, and I might stretch it to 29-30. It's gone up and down a bit depending on where rates are and whether we underspend on capital, how much slippage there is. So it is a short-term expedient, a bit like the energy one, because these are big figures. And it would be remiss of me not to lay a marker down that it's coming, but no decision has been made on any of it. The capital programme, when it comes before Cabinet, will not include these proposals. They will come in due course and they'll be decided by me if they're affordable, and I will give appropriate advice at the time. But it's right that it is in there as a planning assumption, and I've set out how it's to be funded solely in the short term. It will eventually require a transfer from revenue spend to capital financing, and there are opportunities and options available to Cabinet and Council in due course as to how they choose to fund those, and that could include, there could be more generosity in future year settlements, but they're not things I'm prepared to assume at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So to actually get to this 50 million, you must have costed against particular projects, so there must be a breakdown of what you have costed it against.
It's a mixture of almost. There are some things that clearly that are coming through the pipeline where I do anticipate there being some FPR7 reports that will require some spending. But as the leader and I have indicated, much of it is dependent entirely on levelling up bids, and it will depend on what we get or don't get under those. So it is a mixture of items, but at the moment it is my best assessment of a combination of what's known, what could be to come to pass, but for the absolute avoidance of doubt, also what I've said is the absolute maximum I think I am prepared to support as being prudent given the outlook for the public finances for this council. So it is a mixture of all three. There will be reports and FPR7 reports in due course, but it is a mix of all sorts of things. And at the moment, they are not built in to the specific budget proposals because they're not currently being planned to be spent. It is my best estimate of what might come to pass and when it might come to pass. Thank you.
I can see the leader, actually want to come in. Perhaps if I can just slip something else in actually on this. We actually benefit from the MRP at the present time. When is that going to turn, shall we say, well, negative? I know it's not going to be, it's going to equal itself out over the project, but when is that actually going to kick in?
Well, bits of it are very near to kicking. I can't remember perfectly, but I would refer you back to the report that went to council several years ago where the entire schedule was set out for the whole of the 50 years. Because again, the one thing I'm certain to do is be utterly transparent. A tipping point will come. It's soon. I can't remember exactly when, but I just ask you all to revert to that. It's part of the reason why I'm adding to the capital equalisation reserve. You're quite right, Councillor Jones. We know we're underspending and benefited from the MRP review at the moment, but off the top of my head, I can't answer that. I just refer members back to the schedule that went to council 3 or 4 years ago now.
It was 2020, 2028, 2029, and then out to 2032. But the thing is that may have altered. It's a difficult one to work out. You'd have to go back through the figures and what have you. I think it's probably now 2020, 31 or something of that nature, or may have come down a bit, but anyway, it's around that figure. Leader.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Look, I mean, I think just that point first of all, which is, look, we have reprofiled the capital equalisation reserve a number of times, and we've replenished it a number of times, as Mr. Smith has said, and that is the nature of the reserve. So, you know, I don't believe there is any other council in Wales that has made such provision which takes it past not just when we set it up the current term of council, but the next term of council as well. And you know, as Councillor Jones just said, this goes into potentially you know, the 2030s. So it's well beyond the term of this council and then well into the next. So you know, we're doing as much provision as we can with the information we know at this time. I would just draw back, I mean, whether you take it the way Mr. Smith described or the way I described it, but £50 million is the equivalent or less than the equivalent of 4 years of repayment at our current rate. So by the time you've taken £50 million out, you will have already paid back the equivalent or set aside the equivalent in money to pay it back. So it's in essence, by the time you get to it, it's a net zero position. So that's the reality in terms of how you look at this. It comes down to, though, a political choice. And I know Councillor Jones has a job to do in scrutiny in terms of asking relevant questions. He does so at council as well. But it comes back to the same, delivering new schools for the children. Way in which the current government works, you have to put up money in order to get money. It's the reality. You can't escape that. We've always chosen to enter into that process as best we can, look for innovative ways to try and raise the finance to make sure that the burden that falls on the authority isn't passed directly onto taxpayers. And that's why we've been able to give this commitment that it doesn't directly fall to council tax. But the reality is, if you don't do it that way, you're left with the other option, which I'm sure none of you would want to accept, which is you don't build any new schools and you don't deliver the city deal, you don't deliver the levelling up fund possibilities, and you don't deliver any of the necessary changes. That is the alternative, and I don't see anybody advocating that one.
Ben?
Chair, mine's a final brief comment. I totally agree with what the leader has said. I recognise the comments that Councillor Jones has said, and for the avoidance of doubt, grounding it back to the Office of Technical Advice, you have got scrutiny function for a set of budget proposals, which includes my planning outlook till 26-27. The tipping point is clearly after the end of this MTFP. It's right that it's acknowledged that it's coming, and it's right that it's reminded, but for planning assumptions at the moment, I can only forecast with my tea leaves to 26-27. You know, you could equally have asked me someone about what's it going to cost for something in 2050, 2080 or whatever. So, you know, I remain relaxed. Councillor Jones has rightly made the point. The leader has made his points and you've made yours. But at the moment, on the technical build, I've provided for everything I need to provide through the capital equalisation reserve and those assumptions. So you should take some comfort from that. But it is right that you acknowledge that that tipping point is still to come. But it's beyond the life of this report. But it's right that it's acknowledged. That would be my technical advice.
Hey, Jeff?
Yes, thanks for that. I hope it's clarified things in a lot of people's minds. With regards to assumptions, item 19 in the table with regard to assumption on council tax, it's got 4.2 million. What does that actually equate to? I know it's only an assumption at the present time, but what does that equate to with regards to increasing?
So, the long-run planning assumption is a 5% increase. It is consistent with that, but this refers to the yield on council tax. And December's council, maybe November's because I'm losing my dates, agreed my officer advice that because of the £2 million loss on collection fund, you reduced the base by 2%. Yeah. So that is consistent with a yield increase of nearer 3%, but a headline planning assumption of around 5%. But before the leader comes in, as you've rightly acknowledged, I'm going to super emphasise it. No decision has been made, but it is consistent with that sort of planning assumption. And it does factor in the collection fund losses, which I'm now addressing in the base in terms of the officer advice, and which was unanimously agreed at council. Thank you.
Okay, Rob, leader.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Ben said and just remind members that we are also currently awaiting the final decision from the Fire Authority in terms of their levy. they are considering, or they've made a request of an 18% increase in their levy. That would equate to a net cost to this authority of between 2 and 2.2 million, and would, if we were absorbing that cost, equate to 2 to 2.2% on council tax. So, even to start the process on council tax, we need to understand what decisions other bodies are making. We cannot fetter the decision of the fire authority, because they will make their own decision, but that money has to be found from within this council's resources when that decision is made. It is not like the police levy, which is added to the precept that we set. So, for Councillor Jones's information, if the fire authority go through with that, you're already starting at 2.2% just to begin the calculation.
Okay, thank you. Ben, do you want to add anything?
No, that is a fat finger and a legacy hand. I've got nothing further to add. If my hand was still up, apologies. But I agree with what the leader has said. We have had robust discussions with the fire authority, and he's absolutely right in terms of the technical build. And I did draw your attention to it. It is a material part of any potential council tax increase, subject to what the fire authority determines.
Okay, thank you all. We've been just under an hour on this particular topic. I'm absolutely sure we're definitely going to come back to it, because we have another pre-decision scrutiny in February prior to the meeting of Cabinet. That being the case, if everybody's happy, I will move on to item 7 on the agenda, which is the revenue and capital budget monitoring for the second quarter. Ben, do you want to take us briefly through it? Because
I will be brief on this one, Chair. This is second quarter, and we're getting close to Cabinet soon receiving the third quarter. So I draw your attention to the recommendations and the advice I gave to Cabinet. Recommendations 3 and 4, which continued, and Cabinet supported my advice, which is to reinforce that directors must try to avoid overspending. Recommendation 3, but recommendation 4, recognising we're very late in the year and most of it is driven by pay awards, and they can only be contained to such an extent. We've now had resolution of the local government pay award. It's still in dispute, as we talked about earlier, on the teachers pay award, which is referenced in recommendation 5. I draw your attention to the table just after section 2.3, which indicated I gave advice that the first quarter, once the pay awards were in, it would get worse before it could potentially get better. And you have a forecast service overspending of 13 million before COVID reimbursement, just around £9 million after expected COVID reimbursement. That should not be surprising. All directorates forecasting an overspend bar myself, but mine is predominantly as a result of CTRS, which we referenced earlier, and deliberately being held to offset the tax losses on the collection fund. Jump to section 3.2, it remains the same as first quarter. Contingency fund is fully allocated because I'm scraping together everything I had spare to be able to fund the unfunded pay awards in the current year, which again we've talked about, but that's why that table indicates that the balance is expected to be 0. I will whiz on again to the summary table, which is in section 4.1, the revenue summary. It indicates service overspending of 13 million, that long-standing council tax shortfall, my mitigating figures, and then I end up just under a £3 million overspend forecast. But crucially, that remains including teachers' pay, most of which falls to school budgets, and the bit in bold below that indicated an anticipated £3.4 million of that cost pressure falling to schools, and them drawing from reserves. It will not fall to the council ultimately. So it remains the case that we are balanced overall, because that schools reserve will be drawn first and reported in school spending, which is itself consolidated into the education reported outturn. It's just the vagaries of how it is. Section 5 continues with, this is this perennial, I turn up and go, whoopee, most of the capital programme hasn't been spent. It's for others to make and pass comment on that. But all the time, I'm not spending the money, I'm saving it, and I'm not financing it. And therefore, that's why I keep reporting I've got a mega underspend on capital financing and how I'm able to keep topping up the capital equalisation reserve. Section 6, the housing revenue account, very briefly, we normally say it looks after itself. There are clear emerging pressures in there, and I know the relevant cabinet member continues to be concerned. It's getting tighter. And will report accordingly at third quarter. But there is nothing overall to be overly concerned about. But again, you'll be aware housing revenue account must remain entirely ring-fenced and live within its own means. I rapidly draw your attention to Appendix A, which pulls it all together. You can get past all the verbiage in the report. This table shows services are, end column, £13 million overspent at forecast. My mitigations in the next 3 lines. My assumption at this point, without the capital financing underspend in, the third quarter will put a figure on there. The main report refers to at least a £5 million underspending on capital financing. I suspect it will be higher underspend. But again, that flows into the capital equalisation reserve for all the reasons we've talked about previously. I draw your attention to the bottom of the page where you've got the shortfall in council tax of about the 2 million, which we've put right in the base for the coming year. We've talked about previously. And then if you jump into the column before the end, look at earmarked reserves. There is that figure, 30,790,000 to be drawn from earmarked reserves. That's before schools. I expect schools to be another 10 million on top. It's a very, very big figure, mostly as a result of pay overspends, which I'm having to finance. But it is also, to be fair, because if you look at the preceding column, it is also because the Economic Recovery Fund was set up with £45 million in it ultimately, and the bulk of that was already committed and, as the leader has said, being planned to be spent. So there was a very large planned draw from reserves anyway. It'd be much worrier if the planned draw from reserves was naught and then it was 30 million quid. It's only a couple of £1 million up, but for the avoidance of doubt, the second quarter is going to be very similar for third, is indicating that sort of level of draw from reserves with a bit added back in admittedly to the capital equalisation reserve and schools on top, which is why I stick to the advice I gave on the previous item, which is up to £40 million in current year, £30 million next year, manageable in the short term, but the outlook remains really, really challenging. But there are no surprises. There's nothing materially different from first quarter. And I suspect whereas first quarter it went a bit worse than second quarter, I expected it maybe a little bit better. But the overall message remains the same. A material draw from reserves and it's balanced. We all know the reasons for it, much of it planned, but some of it having to be additional draws to mitigate the risks that this council and every other council in Wales, if you go to Wales Online and look at the various local papers, everyone is in the same position. It's just varying degrees of the degree of overspend and how much they've got available to deploy in reserves. So I don't think there are any surprises. I don't think there'll be the same amount of questions. I'll stop there. I mean, I don't think there's anything I need to add. I'll be guided if there are any pressing matters. I suspect most of them probably refer to the items we've already discussed in the previous item. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, any questions or comments? I think the most interesting table is the contingency fund on 3.2, and be witnessing to see what that looks like in the Q3 performance monitoring.
I can't do the discourtesy of revealing too much before Cabinet knows, but I remain with my overall position, which is I do not expect the third quarter to be any more surprising than the second or the first. You'll be aware, ordinarily, we don't spend it all in year, but because of the pressures, I've said consistently in Q1 and 2, and without revealing any detail, I'm pretty confident I'll be revealing in Q3
and
to
I'm
Cabinet.
pretty confident they will spend it as well.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's no other comments, can we then move on to the next item, which is performance monitoring? And you're more than welcome to stay if you want to, Mr. Smith, for this riveting report.
As you've been so generous, I think I will beat a retreat at this point with your blessing.
Are you sure
Thank
about
you
that
kindly.
now? You
Yes,
can stay if you want
yes.
to, but there we are.
Thank you very much.
Is Richard, Councillor David Hopkins on? No. That being the case, then can I ask Richard Rowlands for his
Thank you, Chair.
morning?
Thank you, Chair. If I could just start off by drawing the panel's attention to the pie chart, which you will find on page 76 or page 1 in your papers. In fact, I'll refer to the page numbers in the bottom left-hand corner of the report to make it easier as we go along. Now that pie chart will show you the overall position that Q2. So out of the 27 comparable indicators in the report, 14 of those indicators showed improvement or maintaining trends. 2 showed a drop in performance, but that was directly attributable to the pandemic. 4 showed a decline, but within just 5% of the previous result. And then 7 showed a drop in performance, which is not directly related to the effects of the pandemic. There were 6 new indicators during Q2 as well, mainly as a result to the first priority within the report, which is safeguarding people from harm, which you'll see on page 2. And if we look at the director's overview on page 2, and if I could just summarize the key points from this overview, They point out that the KPIs in this particular priority, as I mentioned earlier, had been reviewed and revised because of the social services performance framework, and these will be supplemented by further indicators on corporate safeguarding in line with the corporate development of Oracle Fusion and also the development of the new corporate plan. The overview states that performance remains strong, but challenges also remain in terms of workforce capacity, which is the issue across health and social care. The rate of looked after children has fallen compared to 10 years ago, but early help capacity, which is important to that success, is being challenged by high demand and capacity issues. We don't have any comparable indicators in the report regarding adult services, but the overview points out to the shift to preventative and wellbeing approaches, which is envisaged by the Social Services Wellbeing Act, which have yet to be fully embedded due to investment being directed towards health boards, although the council is committed to investing in preventative models to allow people to remain at home, and that is reflected in the council's investment into integrated reablement services and supporting informal carers. In terms of reablement, performance is showing that bedded reablement is performing more effectively than reablement at home, probably because of a lack of capacity, including in terms of long-term domiciliary care, which means there is greater reliance on informal care and the need to identify informal carers and to give them an assessment in their own right. And then the director's overview concludes by saying that a proxy measure for the overall deficit in care capacity will be sought. Just looking at some key points within the performance data, we can see some improving trends. So if we look at page 5, there we have a measure on the percentage of visits of children on the Child Protection Register which are not overdue, and that's shown an improvement. It's a 12% improvement compared to the same period last year. On the same page, we have the number of children and young people supported by Child and Family Services, and that's showing an over a 6% improvement. And then on page 6, we have the number of children on the local authority's Child Protection Register, which has shown a 7.5% improvement. As I mentioned earlier, there has been an increase in the number of children and young people supported by the early help hubs, and the demand that has increased there, which you can see on page 6. And that's due to changes in which the way the data is recorded, and also, as I mentioned, the increase in referrals for early help. And I'll pause there, Chair, in case there are any questions.
Yeah, I think the page numbers are a bit, because the page numbers I've got for safeguarding on especially CFS 24 is page 8, and that is the reduction in the number of children and young people supported by the Child and Family Services. And then the next page is about the number of children and young people supported by early help hubs at the end of the, and it's declining. It's better it's declining and not going up, is it not?
Which page are you looking at? Sorry, Councillor.
It's page 9, CFS 25.
I seem to have done page numbers. I'm referring to that particular performance indicator is down, and
Yeah.
of course the figures rising.
Leader.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. Just to explain, Councillor Hopkins is sitting in on the Corporate Joint Committee briefing for me, so I could attend this meeting. That's why Councillor Hopkins isn't here for this item, just to explain.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Richard?
Sure. Okay, on to the next priority, which is improving education and skills. So that's on page 7 on the online pack. Again, referring to the director's overview, which is on page 7, which, and again, just to summarize the key points in that. Pupil attendance figure, which you can actually see on pages 9 and 10, show that attendance levels remain lower than the pre-pandemic levels, which I believe is a national issue. Improving attendance is a key priority for schools, so the use of whole school and targeted approaches. Guidance has been updated and shared with the schools, and a new policy and strategy to support that work is also in development. The number of learners being permanently excluded has halved in comparison with the same reporting period last year. And then in terms of key stage 4 and A-level year groups, the return to externally verified examinations saw above average performance in Swansea. And the implementation of the Additional Learning Needs Act is progressing well. Just a couple of other things from the data. I've already mentioned the attendance data. So on page 9, there was an increase in the number of apprenticeships or trainee starts in the council from 27 to 60. So that's a 122% increase. So that's good news. But on page 10, we see a fall in the number of training and employment person weeks created by Beyond Bricks and Mortar for unemployed and economically inactive people. We see a drop there. That's nearly a 36% fall. And I'll pause there again, Chair.
I'm not quite sure if there's the comments actually are helpful at all on that one, to be honest with you. I think we'll have to wait and see what it continues to be in the coming months, to be honest with you, Richard. I don't necessarily think the comments on that particular item are helpful. Leader, you've got your hand up.
Apologies, Chair, it's legacy.
Oh, right, okay. Then Richard, unless there's sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah, it was just a comment on that one, really. I suppose the attendance figures are look quite concerning. I know they're within 5%, but we don't want to be seeing year-on-year reductions at all, do we really? And I know a number of us will be governors, and it's a conversation that we're having locally as well. Just wanted to kind of comment really that I know there's quite a proactive approach being taken by the CDC on this, and so it'd be really good to kind of see how that plays out then in the performance monitoring, because I know in the next couple of sessions that they've got planned to look specifically at that inclusion and attendance.
Okay, thank you. We currently looking, and there are a number of schools which have got problems with attendance, but I think there are other schools which have done quite well. So I think it's a question of, when we have the figures, we need to examine them a bit more closely in the future to find out what the schools that have got good attendance are doing with the ones that have got bad attendance and what they are not doing. Okay, anyone else? Then can we move on, Richard, to economy and infrastructure?
Okay, so the director's overview you'll find on page 11 is a comprehensive description of what's been done to support economic recovery, improve housing, meeting our decarbonisation targets and encouraging tourism as well. Just a couple of key points on the data. On page 18, we've seen an improvement compared to the same period last year in the number of projects with social benefit clauses in them in terms of Beyond Bricks and Mortar. And then on page 20, a slight fall, 3.4% fall in the percentage of plan applications determined 8 weeks. That's largely due to vacancies within the team.
Okay, are there any questions or comments on this section? No? Oh, David, did you have your hand up? You're on mute, David.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was just on the Debenhams Quadrant Centre there. Seems to be dragging on. Is it any? Do you think we'd have that before the end of the financial year to have a named someone in that centre, or is it going to go forward to next year?
I have to say, Dave, this is probably the wrong committee to ask that question. Next week we've got the development committee. It'd probably be better to ask in that scrutiny board. I think in this one it's about the performance of not the actual individual projects. So I suspect if you attend in the development one next week, it might be better to ask the officers at that meeting as opposed to this one. But I noticed the leaders. His leaders put his hand up.
Sorry, Chair. You're absolutely the right point. I think you made there. The issue here will be that even if that question is asked at the other meeting, given the commercial confidentiality around any arrangements being progressed there, that would need to be done in private session, potentially for members to have that discussion. I would just say that we are continuing to progress all options we can to resolve the issue in the Quadrant Centre, but I am unable to give any details in public session at this time for commercial confidentiality issues.
Just to reassure you, Leader, that we have made arrangements for a confidential briefing for members of the Scrutiny Board next week to discuss a number of issues, one of them being what's happening with the Quadrant, but there's other issues as well. And we've made arrangements for them to be done in camera so that we can have a candid discussion. Okay, Richard, can you carry on? I think tackling poverty is the next one, is it?
That's right. Yeah, tackling poverty. So we have the director's overview on page 21. Again, another comprehensive description, particularly outlining the impact from the cost of living crisis on people's standard of living and what's been done to try and address that. Just some key points on the data. So on pages 24 and 25, we can see that there are increased processing times for council tax and housing benefits. We have staff continuing to be diverted at the moment to administer Welsh Government grants, and also more recently some loss of staff to other council services as well. So staff will need to be recruited and trained, which will take some time before we can expect an improvement in performance. On page 26, we have a reduced amount of welfare benefits that could be secured by the Welfare Rights Unit. That's due to the ongoing impact from the welfare reform, and related to that, there was an increase in the need for appeals representation during the quarter, and for the service, maximising people's income remains a key focus. On page 26, we have an increase in the average number of days homeless families spend in bed and breakfast accommodation. Now that figure does tend to fluctuate a lot, but there is an increase compared to Q2 last year, largely due to a general lack of all combined is putting pressure on the availability of a temporary accommodation and making move on to more permanent accommodation that much more challenging. And then finally, on page 27, we see an improvement in the numbers of people gaining employment through employability support, and also in the numbers of adults achieving accredited qualifications with council support.
Any questions or comments? Rebecca?
Thanks, Chair. I've got two, if I may. The first is kind of a follow-up from my question the last time we received this report, Richard, which is around the processing times, and I understand why they're declining, but we talked a little bit about the impact of them declining last time, and we were reassured in this meeting that actually the impact on individuals was deemed relatively low. However, since then, the processing times have gotten worse again, and I'm just wondering, if I am an individual who is submitting a housing benefit claim for the first time, for example, or a council tax reduction, I suppose I'm perhaps likely to be in receipt of some of those grants that are being processed, but I would just, and I appreciate you might not have the answers, but I would just appreciate, again, further reassurance that we're not leaving people in really dire straits for over a month now. It's looking so. That was my first question really, and then the second question I had is around, sorry, let me just refer back to the report. In terms of the POV 05 indicator, it strikes me really that if the reason for that continuing to decline is actually welfare reform resulting in less benefit income being available to people, then that indicator is not really telling the story that we need it to tell, because actually it doesn't reflect the successes of the welfare rights team in terms of securing, income maximisation, basically. So I'm just wondering whether it's time to review that indicator to perhaps make it more about, percentage success or number of individuals who have seen, income increases or that kind of thing, because a financial value in the current climate appears to be, just not quite painting the right picture.
Okay, I think there's two issues there. I think the first issue about the performance on the benefit, the processing time. I think we need to think about writing to the cabinet member about that. I think it's probably be easier to write because, as you rightly say, I don't think Richard has that answer. So I think if we put that in a letter to the cabinet member and ask that question. As for changing the performance indicator, again, I think that's a question for the cabinet member. I don't think, Richard, I don't think you can change it without authorization anyway. So I think those 2 points, Rebecca, are very well made points, but points that need to be put to the cabinet member. And I think Rachel can put it in a letter and we specifically ask those questions.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Richard?
Okay, so on to the penultimate priority, which is on page 28. So the overview there, I think just quickly summarize it. It talks about progress across a number of different areas, including the work to review the council's transformation strategy, starting work on a new corporate plan, which will come to council in March, continuing to work to upgrade the council's back office systems, to develop a public participation strategy, and finalising a workforce strategy as well. And just a couple of points on the data. So on page 30, we have figures showing an increase in staff sickness, again, due to the impact from the pandemic and the continuing impact, delays to health treatments, issues with personal stress, and also pressures from within the labour market itself. On page 31, we see a small drop, nearly 3% in the number of online payments. There are fewer transactions this quarter compared to the same period last year, but the value of those transactions has increased by almost 11%. And on the same page, we see an improvement in the number of forms completed online for automated processes.
Okay, are there any questions or comments on this issue? No. If not, Richard, can I thank you very much for your presentation? Again, we'll be right. Sorry, Rebecca, you put your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. There's just one more theme area, which was the nature climate change one. And my question about that was, I know we've got updated indicators coming, and I was just wanted to know, can we expect to have those for the next quarter's report?
I'm not sure, Richard.
Yep, so we're working on those now. This is all part of the corporate plan development. Our sort of target is to try and get these indicators ready for the first quarter's reporting. It obviously does depend on the process and the technical process in terms of trying to define those indicators and get them ready for reporting, but that's our intention.
Okay. Okay, well, that being the case, no other questions or comments. Can I thank you, Richard, for your very comprehensive report? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, then we go on to number 9, item 9, which is the Sustainable Swansea update. Now, I'm not sure, do you, Leader, want to start this off in the absence of the Deputy Leader?
Yes, Councillor Lewis is unavailable for this meeting, so I'm sitting in to cover any political questions that may form, but I'll hand over to Martin on this item, as Martin's attending, obviously, to speak to the Sustainable Swansea technical part of the report.
Okay, thank you. Chief Exec?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, it seems quite a while ago since we last discussed this. I think in the council chamber a couple of years ago, where there were ongoing reviews of the Sustainable Swansea programme that were brought to scrutiny over a couple of years. There was a requirement to bring a final report to scrutiny to effectively close down that old programme. Unfortunately, that was delayed as a result of COVID implications. So this really is that wrap-up report, which was promised some time ago. My apologies for the delay in it being presented. The reason why it was requested to come back, if I recall, was, a lot of the previous work had been through scrutiny and discussed with scrutiny at the time. And as you'll notice, some of it has been superseded now by the subsequent Achieving Better Together programme. However, there were some actions that had been identified in those original, particularly the commissioning reviews, where I believe scrutiny wanted a final update, and hopefully the report provides that level of detail in terms of the appendix that's attached in relation to a number of those reviews and a number of those outstanding recommendations. So I wasn't intending to go through the report in any more detail than that, Chair, just really an opportunity if any members wish to ask any questions. We've also got some officers here who were involved in that process previously, and between us we should be able to deal with any questions that you've got. So thank you, Chair.
Okay, right. Any questions from members? Right then, that being the case, can I start off by saying thank you very much for bringing the report, Chief Exec. It is disappointing that it's taken so long from the commissioning reviews. There are a number of the commissioning reviews which we actually sat in on, and some of them I'm not sure where we are with them, because if you read some of the reports, they don't actually say too much, if I'm honest. If you look at the parks and cleansing, it started off in December 2016, went through to 19, progress to November, outcomes and savings, 7-day working review will be considered future part of authority-wide review. Future action, none. So we did all the review. We didn't deliver much at all, if anything. So I got to ask yourself, what did we actually get out of that review? Because if you read, the hanging baskets sales went up a bit. Really speaking, there's not a huge amount that's come out of it. And one thing I would say is that I think we need to have a look at this historically, in the context that when we started this process, what it was about. And I'm afraid that that's the bit that I'm concerned myself about, because we spent quite a lot of time on the commission reviews, spent a lot of time, and some of them were really good. The public protection ones were good. We'd done the services, the tech services, they were good. Others weren't so good. But having gone through this report, to be honest, it didn't appear to be as much coming out of this process right across the board as there was in some aspects of it. And I think that, looking at where we're coming from now and where we're going to go, it has been, I think it has been worthwhile in some respects, but I was a bit disappointed that it wasn't more successful. Leader, you put your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. I think I have to disagree with you on your final comment there, because it sounds like a catch-all comment, and I don't think we can rewrite or reinterpret the approach that was created for Sustainable Swansea Fit for the Future. So, in terms of why we were doing that back in 2016, if you remember, we were under a long-term period of austerity under the then Cameron government. That was taking significant chunks of funding out of public services. And if you remember, we had a budget gap of close to 100 million, I believe, over the period. Now, we know that Sustainable Swansea has delivered close to £70 million worth of savings over the period, and it has contributed significantly to us being able to reform services and to modernise the way in which we deliver services. Saving out the other side. Some of them, for instance, dealt with some of the myths that were around, because there was, a great belief that the council was internally more expensive for many of the services it was delivered. And I think through some of the commission reviews, we proved that not to be the case. We were competitive and actually offering a very good value for money service. So I think we can't lose sight of why we were going into those commission reviews, and we didn't predetermine the outputs from those reviews, because the reviews were there to be run and to deliver either a confirmation that what we were doing was the best we could possibly do with what we've got, or to consider new ways of delivering those services and potentially delivering savings out the other side. We, of course, learnt lessons as we went through the review process, and I know Martin in his previous role did a lot of work to refine that process as we went. But I couldn't agree with your statement that it's been unsuccessful, because we know when we've had other reports brought around the savings that were delivered over the period from a number of commissioning reviews and a number of reviews that supported Sustainable Swansea, that money and savings were delivered, and improvements to services, significant improvements to services, were also delivered as part of the overall process throughout that period, because it's a long time. And we've got to remember that then, of course, at the tail end of this, when the Sustainable Swansea programme was coming to an end, we then encountered COVID and the pandemic, which created a further 2 years of unusual events and unprecedented events, which meant that we had to, when we moved to the new programme, which we're now working through, we had a very, very disruptive period for a number of years in between then. So I just think we've got to, always without comments, make sure that they are in the context of what was going on at the time.
I'm very aware of what you said, Leader, and I'm very aware of what I said. As a matter of fact, I took part in quite a number of the commissioning reviews, and I was very complimentary about a number of our services, and I actually pointed out to, and I'm sure Martin will reinforce what I said, when we did the technical officers, and we've done the surveyors, and we've done even the DLO to some extent, we were very complimentary about how it was going. I was hoping that the rest would be as good as some of them, but they weren't. And, we, as you say, we have learned from it. But I think overall, we did do a lot of work, and we did, I have to say, as I've just said already, some of them were very, very good. And it did debunk this idea that the private sector was better and more efficient than the public sector, because that wasn't the case in 2 or 3 very good services of ours. But, it's still a lot of work in here that needs to be looked at. And I take your point that we've moved on to something else now, and we need to look at that as well. Martin, you were...
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and yeah, we did spend many a happy hour in various discussions on these commissioning reviews over a number of years, and perhaps apologies, perhaps I wasn't clear enough on my brief introduction. There was a huge amount of work that was previously presented to Scrutiny that my recollection was Scrutiny were largely happy with and accepted that those progress and outcomes and those positivities through those reviews had been achieved. This document was picking up, as I recall, the remaining elements that hadn't concluded when that last report was brought before you, probably around now 4 years ago. So it's not surprising that this is effectively the tail end of that original programme. And look, I understand, and I'd be happy to review if there were any elements contained within this report and this appendix that you're unhappy about or wish to have further clarification on. We'd be more than happy to take that away and come back on those specific points. What we haven't done, and I know Sarah's on the call as well, and Sarah was involved in that previous session and the previous programme with me, what we haven't done is reiterated all of those positive outcomes from all of those previous reviews, because they would have been presented previously. That probably gives a skewed approach, because this appears to show, therefore, that what was remaining didn't achieve very much. I would disagree with that, and I think the numbers do speak for themselves in terms of a number of the other reviews, and Chair, the number of the examples you've just given that I recall very, very well. So be more than happy to undertake any further work. Clearly, this was superseded by the then subsequent Achieving Better Together programme. Some of the reviews are inevitably ongoing. If you look at some of the activity, for example, within Social Services Department, those reviews that were started under the Sustainable Swansea programme were effectively the catalyst and are forming a major part of the transformation programme that will be ongoing. And that is likely to be permanently ongoing because of the need to continually review those services. So I'd be more than happy, Chair, if there were any specific elements where any members wished us to look at and come back with some further clarification. And if there are any of those elements that actually you believe haven't been fully addressed, we are at the moment finalising the programme that feeds into the new transformation strategy, that was approved by council prior to Christmas, and we are identifying the list of areas that we will be including for the coming year. And I, again, be more than happy if there were things that you felt needed to be included in that haven't been addressed either through Sustainable Swansea or the Achieving Better Together programme. We can look to include those as part of that review. This isn't about shying away from looking at those areas critically, but I think it's probably slightly out of context to look at this and see this as the totality of the outcomes of Sustainable Swansea. Thank you, Chair.
Well, what I'll do is, right, well, I'll give you an example, Martin. The additional needs, we know. Additional learning needs. Review was not progressed against the commission review process, but transferred to additional learning needs alignment in the 2018 Act, progressed under a separate project. That's what I'm trying to say. You know,
Okay.
It would be nice to see what actually public protection. Well, that was very successful. Let's be blunt about it, and we did very well out of that one. The catering one, I'm not again. You know, there's issues around that I think we need to do. But I think the best thing we need to do is actually put them in a letter to you, and then we move on from there, because I think this may not be the right venue to actually go into the nitty-gritty of this anyway.
Yeah, happy to do that, Chair, and happy to come back if with a formal response if you wish to put any of those comments in a letter. More than happy to pick that up.
I will. Right, I'm gonna find it. I've lost my page now, so I'll have to find it again. No, I think that being the case, has anybody got any further comments they want to add? No. I think you're looking very bored with that, Paxton. Okay, that being the case, is it? Anybody got anything else, Paxton? You're on mute, Paxton.
Sorry, yeah. Coming back in terms of commission reviews, my understanding was as part of the commission reviews and the placing the new contracts, we were going to be speaking to service users, particularly in the area of social services, as to get their reactions as to the effectiveness of the new contracts that were in place and how well they were working as far as they were concerned. I suspect because of COVID, this didn't happen, but I'm just wondering if there's any intention to have a look at how the new contracts that were put in at that time satisfied end users at the end of the day. So, because that was an important part of it, because it was the way that we were setting up new contracts. And if we're going to repeat the process, we need to have that sort of assessment again, I think.
Okay, what I'll do is we'll put that in the letter to Martin as well, so that we can get some feedback on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, if that's the case, can I thank you, Martin, for bringing the report. We obviously will take some time on producing a letter and then send it off to you.
Thank you, Chair. Okay.
The next item on the agenda, item 10, are the letters, the scrutiny letters. Are there any comments on any of these? No? And then the final item on page, item 11, is the work plan. And you can see that our next meeting is the medium-term financial plan on the 14th of February. And it's pre-decision scrutiny. Okay. And then obviously then it's March, there's the quarterly review, etc. If there's no other questions or comments, can I thank you all for your attendance? And I'll see some of you this afternoon.
Yes. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chair.